Okay, as I sew down this quilt, I really don't need all these other rows. If you're like me, like I said before, I just keep quilting the second row over and over again. I realign it, I'm realigning to the first row, but I sew the second row over and over again. So this is the row that we really need to pay attention to. As I'm sewing across, I will sew this section, then I will modify the last, I will sew this section, then I will modify this section over here. I do that all the way down the quilt. I don't go all the way to the bottom. This quilt, I believe I said, was 72 inches. Well, if I have 5 rows, chances are that last row is not going to fit in there. If it's 14.35 inches high, chances are, because of the shrinkage, I may only have like 14 inches instead of 14.35. So I will quilt all the way down, just using the second row over and over again, and I will take the second row. When I come to the bottom of the quilt, I will take this row and modify the height. Now, let's say I've gone ahead and quilted it. Now I will modify the height of this row to, say I only have 14 inches now. Let me go ahead and do that manually because I can't see that on the video. 14, and I'll select, but I also have to do this section at 14. And so now I'll do the same thing, adjusting the width on this after I've quilted this area. Then I'll do the same thing, stop, check the width. But by changing this last row, here again, stick with me here, we've already quilted the whole quilt. I don't know if I'm making sense here or not, but we've already quilted the whole quilt by just sewing the second row over and over again. I'm at the very end of the quilt, the last row that I'm working with now. I changed that to 14 inches because I measured the actual quilt and I only had 14 inches to the seam that I wanted to end at. Remember, we're not sewing off the quilt, there's no clips, we've got a seam that we want to put a border on. So I'm sewing this section, and then I'm going to do the same thing with this section. And so that's how I quilt the whole quilt to stay within the borders. If the quilt is really, really long, this is only 72 inches. If it was really, really long, I would take maybe the second to the last row and start measuring the actual quilt and splitting up the differences of those last 2 rows. Instead of 14 inches, I may have to change that to 13.75. To the naked eye, it probably isn't going to be noticeable if you do have to do that. But the goal here is to make sure that those patterns are right inside the seam without having to do a lot of tie-offs or jump stitches and things like that. So that's pretty much how I would do it to quilt within borders. Hope that made sense.